There's a door at the top of the stairs inside Graceland that nobody opened for 48 years. Not the cleaning staff. Not the security guards who walk those hallways every single night. Not the millions of tourists who passed through that mansion and bought their tickets and took their photos. Not even the family members who inherited everything Elvis Presley left behind. That door stayed shut through funerals and lawsuits and conspiracies and decades of rumors. It stayed shut while the world outside changed beyond recognition. It stayed shut while Elvis's legend grew larger with every passing year, until he wasn't just a man anymore, but something closer to a myth. And then, in January of 2025, Riley Keough, Elvis's granddaughter, the last of his direct line, handed an archivist a brass key and said it was time. What they found on the other side of that door did not look like what anyone expected. It didn't look forgotten. It didn't look abandoned. It looked deliberate. Every single item had been placed with care. Every box had been labeled in the same handwriting. Elvis's own handwriting, as if he had spent his final months quietly organizing the evidence of his own life, arranging it all into chapters that no one would read until long after he was gone. One of those boxes was labeled simply, After, dated 1977, the year he died. We're going to talk about what was inside that box. But to understand why it matters, to understand why a man at the height of his fame would climb alone into his own attic and carefully pack away pieces of himself like a man preparing for a long trip he knew he wasn't coming back from, we have to start at the beginning. We have to start with the house itself and what it became and what it was never supposed to be. Elvis Presley was 22 years old when he drove through the gates of Graceland for the first time as its owner. It was a spring morning in 1957, and the property sat on the edge of Memphis, Tennessee, on 14 acres of land that included a barn, a stable, and horses grazing in the Tennessee sun. The house had already been named Graceland by the family who built it decades earlier. Elvis didn't change it. He said it felt right, just the way it was. In those early years, Graceland was pure life, loud and warm and overflowing. Elvis's parents moved in. Friends came and went at all hours. There was a chimpanzee, an actual chimpanzee, named Scatter, who wore little human outfits and had a habit of causing chaos at parties that people still talk about. The staff used to say Scatter acted out the parts of Elvis that Elvis himself kept hidden from the cameras. But even in those early days, while the parties were running and the music was playing and Scatter was stealing drinks off tables, Elvis built himself something quiet in the middle of all of it. He carved out a corner of the property and called it the meditation garden. Fountains, flowers, white columns, a place where he could be still. This was the Elvis that the screaming crowds never saw. The one who went looking for quiet in the middle of the loudest life in America. Downstairs, the basement had a television room with 3 screens running simultaneously, which in the 1960s was the kind of thing that made visitors stop and stare. There was the jungle room with its green shag carpet creeping up the walls like something out of a fever dream, furniture that looked imported from another planet, a recording studio built into the back of the house because sometimes Elvis wanted to make music at 3 in the morning and didn't want to go anywhere to do it. And across the yard, in the racquetball building, there was a piano. That piano was the last instrument Elvis ever played. He sat down at it a few hours before he died and played gospel songs until the sun came up. That was August 16th, 1977. By that point, Elvis was 42 years old, and the gap between the man the world saw on stage and the man living inside Graceland had become something nobody could look at directly. He had gained a tremendous amount of weight. His performances had become unpredictable. He forgot words to songs he had sung 10,000 times. He swayed on stage in ways that frightened the people around him. The curtains at Graceland stayed closed against the daylight because Elvis had long since reversed his schedule entirely, sleeping through the day and moving through the night. His girlfriend, Ginger Alden, woke up that August afternoon and noticed the house was too quiet. She knocked on the bathroom door. No answer. She pushed it open. She found him on the floor. His road manager began CPR immediately. The ambulance came within minutes. The paramedics worked on him the entire way to Baptist Memorial Hospital. But by 3:30 that afternoon, the doctors said Elvis Presley was dead. The official cause announced that same evening by the medical examiner, was cardiac arrhythmia. His heart had simply stopped, they said. Natural causes. A simple, clean verdict for a death that was anything but simple or clean. The toxicology report told a different story. It came out later, after the cameras had moved on, and what it showed was that Elvis's blood contained extraordinary levels of at least 10 different prescription medications at the time of his death. Powerful sedatives, heavy painkillers, stimulants. The kind of combination that does not accumulate by accident. The kind of combination that requires a steady supply and someone willing to provide it. That someone was Dr. George Nikopoulos. Most people who knew him called him Dr. Nick. He had been Elvis's personal physician since 1967, and in the final 8 months of Elvis's life alone, just January through August of 1977, he had written Elvis over 195 separate prescriptions. Do the math on that, and you get roughly one prescription every 36 hours for 8 straight months. The year before had been even worse. In 1976, Dr. Nick had prescribed Elvis nearly 19,000 individual pills. When the medical boards eventually came for him, Dr. Nick had an explanation ready. He said Elvis suffered from genuine chronic conditions, pain from an old head injury, severe intestinal problems, deteriorating eyesight. He said the medications were necessary. And then he said something that has never stopped being remarkable. He said that flooding his patient with pills was actually a form of protection. That if he hadn't supplied them, Elvis would have gotten them somewhere else, from someone less careful. He framed a decade of dangerous overprescription as a kind of harm reduction. Tennessee did not agree. Dr. Nick was charged in 1980 with multiple counts of indiscriminate prescribing. A jury acquitted him, but the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners kept investigating, and in 1995, 18 years after Elvis died, they permanently revoked his license. But here is the thing about Elvis's death that a researcher named Sally Hodel introduced to the conversation in 2020 in a book called Destined to Die Young. She spent years examining Elvis's full medical history and concluded that he had been living with a genetic condition called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, a disorder that attacks the liver and lungs and that significantly weakens the immune system. If she's right, and the evidence she compiled is substantial, then some of what looked like addiction from the outside was actually a man fighting a losing battle against a body that was failing him from the inside, trying to manage pain and illness with tools that were inadequate and dangerous. That doesn't absolve anyone who profited from his suffering, but it changes the portrait. It turns the story from a cautionary tale about excess into something more complicated and more human. A man who was genuinely sick, surrounded by people who were either incapable or unwilling to help him get well. By the time Elvis died, those people had very good reasons to want the full story to stay quiet. Which brings us to why certain parts of Graceland stayed locked. The day after Elvis died, Graceland was overwhelmed. 80,000 people gathered outside the gates within 48 hours. The line of mourners stretched for miles. The grief was not polite or orderly. It was raw and public, and overwhelming in the way that only happens when someone has been a genuine part of people's lives. Not just a name they knew, but a voice that had been in the room with them through the most significant moments of their years. Elvis was buried on August 18th. 17 white Cadillacs led the procession through Memphis. James Brown was there. Sammy Davis Jr. was there. Priscilla was there with 9-year-old Lisa Marie, who was small enough that someone had to lift her to see the casket. Elvis was buried beside his mother, Gladys, at Forest Hill Cemetery. The family thought it was done. 2 days later, a group of men were caught in the cemetery at night trying to steal the coffin. They didn't succeed, but the attempt was enough. Elvis's father, Vernon, made a decision quickly and quietly. In the middle of the following night, Elvis and Gladys were both moved. Reinterred inside the meditation garden at Graceland, the private space Elvis had built for himself in the middle of all that noise. The garden became a grave. The home became a fortress. New security systems went in. Guards were posted around the clock. In the upper floor of Graceland, Elvis's bedroom, his bathroom, the attic above, was permanently sealed. When the estate opened Graceland to the public in 1982, the tour began on the ground floor, and it ended on the ground floor. The The staircase was roped off. The attic door at the top of those stairs was never discussed in any promotional material, never featured on any tour, never explained in any meaningful way. For 48 years, the official answer to any question about the upper floor was always the same: out of respect for the family's privacy. Millions of people came through that house and looked at the gold records and touched the velvet ropes and looked up at the ceiling and wondered what was above them. And the answer, it turned out, was something none of them could have guessed. In the spring of 2024, an attempt was made to force Graceland out of Presley family hands entirely. A company called Nosany Investments filed paperwork claiming Riley Keough had defaulted on a loan worth nearly $4 million and that Graceland would be auctioned to satisfy the debt. Riley's legal team moved immediately. They told the court the documents were forgeries, that Riley had never signed any agreement with this company, that the signatures on the paperwork were not hers. The auction was days away when a judge in Shelby County reviewed the evidence and stopped it. He called Graceland a singular cultural landmark and ruled that losing it to strangers would constitute an irreparable public harm. Nosany Investments sent no one to contest the ruling. The company appeared in filings and then dissolved from the narrative, leaving behind only the question of who had tried to take Graceland and why. After it was over, Riley made a decision. She had been the sole heir to the Presley estate since her mother Lisa Marie died in January of 2023. Lisa Marie had known about the attic, had known what was inside, and had chosen her father's privacy over disclosure. Riley chose differently. She chose documentation. She arranged for a professional archival team to go into the attic for the first time since the summer of 1977 and record what was there. They went in on a cold morning in January 2025. The staircase was narrow. The air at the top was different, cooler than expected, because a small window air conditioning unit had been running in the attic continuously for nearly 50 years, maintained by Graceland's facility staff who serviced it regularly without ever once opening the door beside it. Someone had made sure the contents would be preserved. Someone had planned for the long storage. What the archivist found when the door opened was not a room full of clutter. It was not a space where someone had dumped things randomly over the years. It was organized, deliberately, carefully, almost obsessively organized. The attic had been divided into sections, and each section corresponded to a period of Elvis's life, and each section had been labeled, in his own handwriting, with a name and a date. Tupelo, 1945. First recordings. Army Days. Hollywood. The Comeback Special. Vegas. And at the far end, sitting apart from the others, a single box with 2 words written on it. After. 1977. The archivist started at the beginning with Tupelo. Inside the first box, underneath layers of tissue paper that had yellowed with decades, but held its shape, was a stuffed animal. A bear. One eye missing. The fabric patched in a dozen places with pieces of other fabric, floral cotton, pale blues and pinks, sewn with stitches that were careful but not trained, the stitches of someone who was trying very hard rather than someone who had done it often. Family documents in the Presley archive confirmed what the archivist suspected. This was the toy Elvis had called Bear, his companion through childhood in Tupelo, when his family had almost nothing. The patches on its body were cut from his mother Gladys's own clothing. When Vernon Presley was sent to prison in 1938 for forgery, Elvis was 3 years old. Gladys and Elvis were left alone and nearly destitute. Bear had been there for all of it. Elvis had carried it with him when the family finally left Tupelo for Memphis. And then he had carried it with him, apparently, for the rest of his life, keeping it here in this quiet room at the top of his famous house, a private talisman that nobody knew about. The Army Days box held a Bible, not a decorative one, not a gift Bible with a gold spine, but a working Bible, read so thoroughly that the binding had been repaired with electrical tape at some point, the tape itself now old and brittle. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that was immediately recognizable, Gladys Presley had written a message to her son when she gave it to him before he shipped out in 1958. Throughout the pages, in a different hand, Elvis's hand, there were underlined passages, margin notes, questions written in pencil, prayers written in ink, evidence of decades of private conversation with the text. The last dated entry was from early August 1977, a few days before he died. He had marked Psalm 23. In the Hollywood section, along with photographs and call sheets and props from films, there was a jacket, specifically the leather jacket from Jailhouse Rock, made to costume specifications for the film and worn on screen in one of his most iconic scenes. The jacket had a pocket. Inside the pocket was a small folded piece of paper. On it, in his handwriting, were 4 words, "Were this to disappear." Not as a note to anyone else, as a reminder to himself. The jacket, apparently, was something he put on when he needed to move through the world without being immediately recognized as Elvis Presley, when he needed a few hours of being no one in particular. Next to the Hollywood materials, the archivist found books, not the kind anyone would have predicted. Not guitar guides or music theory texts or Hollywood biographies. These were philosophical and theological texts, Eastern religious thought, comparative religion, books on mysticism and death and what comes after. Many of them have been read multiple times, returning annotations layered on earlier annotations, a private, ongoing conversation with writers and thinkers whose names never appeared in any profile of Elvis Presley. This was the inner life he protected completely. The man searching for something beyond what any stage or screen could give him. In the Vegas section, sealed inside a manila envelope marked confidential in someone else's handwriting, a medical secretary's handwriting, most likely, was a physician's report dated 1974. The archivist photographed it but did not open it at the instruction of the family's legal team, who wanted to review its contents before any decisions were made about disclosure. But the exterior of the envelope referenced cardiac concerns and included a recommendation for significant lifestyle modification. That report was written 3 years before Elvis died. 3 years during which he continued to tour, continued to perform, continued to receive the prescriptions that were quietly destroying what remained of his health. And then the box marked after. What the archivist found inside, it was not what the label implied. It was not materials from after his death. It was materials for after, assembled, the archivist believed, in the final months of his life, by a man who knew the end was closer than anyone around him was willing to say out loud. There were reel-to-reel tapes, practice recordings from 1976, labeled in the same plain handwriting. Not studio sessions, not polished takes. Private recordings. Just Elvis and a microphone, working through songs and directions nobody had ever heard him take, mixing gospel structures with blues phrasing and something that sounded almost experimental, textures that didn't exist yet in the mainstream. A man still trying to find where the music could go. One tape was not labeled at all. The archivist played it and fell silent. It was a recording of Elvis singing Unchained Melody. No accompaniment, no band, no orchestration. Nothing except his voice, recorded in what sounded like a small room, with the slight hiss of the tape behind it. His voice on that recording was not the voice of the 1957 Elvis who had made the world stop. It was older, thinner in places, shaky with something that the archivists and the music historians who later listened to it could only describe as the sound of a person feeling every word as a literal truth. He was not performing the song. He was inside it. The longing in it was not theatrical, and it was recorded, the tape box suggested, sometime in the spring of 1977, a few months before he died. One music historian, after hearing a clip, said it sounded like a man saying goodbye without being able to say the words directly, like someone who understood what was coming and could only speak about it through someone else's melody. There were handwritten lyric sheets in the box as well. Some were songs people knew, drafts of Suspicious Minds with verses that never made the final recording, showing the decisions and the crossings out and the alternatives considered. Others were fragments of things nobody recognized. Songs that were never recorded, never finished, never shared with a producer or a label or a collaborator. Private music, songs he wrote and kept and apparently never intended to release. And at the bottom of the after box, the thing that stopped everyone in the room. A stack of fan letters, still sealed. The envelopes unopened, the stamps intact. Postmarked from across the country and around the world, dates ranging from 1974 through 1977. A woman in Wisconsin wrote that his music had been the only thing that got her through her husband's death. A young soldier in Germany wrote that he listened to Elvis on a tape player in the barracks, and it made him feel less far from home. A teenage boy in California wrote that he was learning guitar and wanted to know if Elvis had any advice for someone who felt like music was the only thing that made sense. An envelope postmarked October of 1976 contained a letter from a fan who had attended one of his concerts and was worried about how he looked. The letter begged him, directly and without embarrassment, to take care of himself, to rest, to step back from the touring schedule that everyone around him could see was unsustainable. He never opened it. The letters weren't in that box by accident. They had been put there deliberately, gathered from wherever they had accumulated, and placed in the after box along with the unfinished songs and the private recordings. Why he kept them sealed is something nobody can answer now. Maybe he couldn't face them. Maybe he kept them for later, and later never came. Maybe he put them in that box because he understood, on some level, that they were evidence of something he was losing access to: ordinary connection, the simple fact of being cared about by strangers who wanted nothing from him except for him to keep existing. What the attic ultimately revealed was not a scandal. It revealed a man who kept his mother's Bible and his childhood bear in the same room as his most private recordings. A man who read philosophy alone in the night and wrote songs he never shared with anyone. A man who wore a costume jacket to disappear into ordinary life. A man who collected letters from people who loved him and couldn't bring himself to read them. A man who knew, in some part of himself, that he was not able to speak aloud, that the end was coming, and who spent his final months quietly putting things in order, labeling boxes, organizing a private archive that he must have known would eventually be opened by someone who would understand what they were looking at. The door at the top of the stairs stayed shut for 48 years because the people who loved him wanted to protect his privacy. But there's another way to look at those 48 years. Elvis put things in that attic and closed the door himself. He organized it carefully and he left it. Maybe those 48 years were exactly what he intended. Maybe he needed the world to change enough, to move far enough from the moment of his death, before the things he left behind could be seen clearly. Not as the remnants of a cautionary tale, but as the interior life of someone who was beneath the gold records and the jumpsuits and the mythology that swallowed him whole, genuinely, fully, irreducibly human. The box marked after was not about what came after his death. It was a message written to the future. A collection of evidence assembled by a man who wanted to be understood in full. The recordings, the unfinished songs, the sealed letters, the Bible with the annotations, the bear with the patches cut from his mother's dress. This was what was hidden at the top of the stairs. Not a secret, not a scandal, just Elvis, the real one, the one he kept for himself, waiting quietly in the dark at the top of a house in Memphis for someone to finally come and find him.